My sister stole 15,000 Brazilian reals from my parents. What happened afterward made her one of the most inspiring people I know. My name is Marina and I'm 25 years old. Until a few months ago, I had a life that most people would consider enviable. I lived with my parents in a comfortable house, worked as a financial analyst at a reputable bank, and had a relationship that seemed perfect in everyone's eyes. But the truth is that my life was far from being what it appeared to be. My family was never rich, but we always had enough. My father works as an engineer at a construction company, and my mother is an administrator at a veterinary clinic. They have always been hardworking, honest people who believed in the value of sacrifice to achieve things. That was the kind of teaching I received since childhood, but I didn't always follow it strictly. I have a younger sister, Juliana, who is 21 years old and is in her third year of college studying administration. There has always been a clear difference in how our parents treated us. When I was in college, I had to work part-time at a bookstore to help pay for my expenses. I did that for 4 years while studying accounting. My parents covered only part of the tuition and made it clear that I needed to learn to be responsible with my finances. Juliana, on the other hand, never had to work a single day. My parents pay absolutely everything for her: tuition, rent for the apartment she rents near campus, food, transportation, clothes, everything. When I mentioned this to my mother, she said that I was older when I started college and that Juliana was more sensitive about her studies. That irritated me, but I tried not to let it affect our relationship too much. Everything began to change when my father had a mild heart attack early in the year. Nothing serious, thank God, but it was enough to scare the whole family. While he recovered, he lost work hours. My mother also had to reduce her hours at the clinic to stay near him. At that time, I began to notice the stress on their faces when they thought no one was looking. One day, I heard my mother talking to my father as I quietly came down the stairs. "Juliana's tuition for the next semester is due in 3 months," my mother said with concern in her voice. "We don't have that money we used to save each month. With the scare we've had, everything is so tight." My father sighed deeply. "We have that property by the river, remember? The one my grandmother left us years ago. There's so much junk accumulated there, so many old things we don't use anymore." "You mean selling things?" asked my mother. "Exactly. We must have things there that still have value. A fishing boat I haven't used since Juliana was born, antique furniture that could be sold, tools I've been collecting for years. If we clean everything up and sell as much as we can, maybe we'll manage to gather a good amount." That night, I went up to my room with a heavy heart. My parents were sacrificing themselves again to pay for Juliana's education, while she lived a life of luxury that she didn't even deserve. I never mentioned anything about what I had overheard. It wasn't my problem to solve. During the next 2 months, I noticed that my parents spent every weekend away from home. I asked where they were going, and they gave vague answers about taking care of the property. Once, when I visited them at the property out of curiosity, I saw that they had done enormous work. There were piles of things to sell, and they were carefully sorting everything. My father was selling his old fishing boat, the one he had built with his own father when he was young. That made me feel a little guilty, but not enough to offer my help. At the end of 2 months, my parents managed to gather exactly $15,000 in cash. I found out about this because I overheard my father talking to my mother in the kitchen while I was preparing my breakfast before going to work. "We managed to gather all 15,000, said my father, holding a thick envelope full of $100, $50, and $20 bills. "It's everything we need for Juliana's tuition to be covered for the next year." "Thank you for doing this," replied my mother, giving him a hug. "I know it wasn't easy selling all those things you loved so much." My father put the envelope on the kitchen table and looked at me. "Marina, I need you to do me a favor. Could you take this money to the bank today and deposit it in the family account? I have an important meeting at work that I can't miss, and your mother has a client who is coming from out of town to make a contract." I looked at the clock. It was 7:45 in the morning and I had left the office only an hour before. "Dad, I really would like to help, but I have an important deadline today. My boss said he needs my report finished by around 3 in the afternoon, and I can't leave during work hours. But tomorrow is my day off. Can I take the money early in the morning before doing anything else?" My father blinked and nodded his head. "That's fine. Just keep the money in a safe place for one night. It's a considerable amount, so be careful." I took the envelope. It was heavy, and I could feel the weight of all those bills. At that moment, I had a strange idea. If my father had trusted me with that important money, perhaps it was because he knew I was too responsible to do something wrong with it. That trust somehow made me think that I deserved to enjoy some of that money for myself too. After all, I had worked hard all these years. I placed the envelope at the bottom of my wardrobe, under some old coats I no longer wore. No one would think to look there. When I got to work, that envelope continued to occupy my thoughts all the time. That night, when I returned home, my heart raced when I entered the door. My sister Juliana was in the middle of the living room, and there were packages and shopping bags scattered everywhere. She was wearing a dress I had never seen before, something that seemed to have cost a fortune, and was holding a brand new latest generation cell phone that cost at least $1,200. Juliana? When did you get home? I asked, trying to sound natural. The semester doesn't end for another week. Hi, Marina, replied Juliana with a smile I didn't like very much. I decided to come home early. I have surprises. She turned to show me all the items she had bought. There were clothes from expensive brands, new shoes, accessories, all with tags still attached. She even had a leather jacket that probably cost more than I earned in a week of work. How did you get money to buy all this? I asked, trying to stay calm. Did you get a job? When? You never mentioned anything about it. Juliana laughed in that annoying way of hers. A job? Are you crazy? Work now. No, of course I didn't get a job. I just found some hidden treasure in the house, let's say. My stomach began to tighten. Without saying anything else, I ran upstairs to my room and opened my wardrobe with trembling hands. I searched under those old coats, desperately rummaging through everything. The envelope had disappeared. My heart began to beat rapidly. I ran down the stairs and found Juliana still admiring herself in the mirror, taking selfies with her new phone. She was completely absorbed, posing and running her hand through her hair. Juliana, I shouted, and she jumped at my tone. Did you go into my room? What? No. Well, yes. I did. My phone charger broke and I wanted to see if you had one I could borrow, she said, shrugging with indifference. I didn't find the charger, but I found an envelope full of money in your drawer. I thought it was family money since it was in our parents' house. And since you're kind of selfish sometimes, I borrowed it without telling you. You borrowed it? Juliana, you took $15,000 that weren't yours. I said, feeling rage take over me. At that moment, Juliana's phone rang. She answered quickly, and I heard a man's voice on the other end saying something about money. Yes, dear, I sent the $10,000 I promised, said Juliana in a sweetened voice I had never heard from her before. I know you really need this. Don't worry about paying me back now. Take care of what you need. The $10,000 are there for you. My blood boiled. $10,000 of my parents' money, which they had sold an old boat to get, had been handed to a man I didn't even know. I took the phone from Juliana's hand and ended the call. Why did you take the money from my room, Juliana? Tell me the truth now. Juliana rolled her eyes at me as if I were being ridiculous. Oh, please, Marina. Do you really want to make a drama out of this? I went into your room to get a charger, because mine broke. I didn't find anything, but I found that envelope full of money in your drawer. You left money just lying there, so I thought maybe it was money that was available in the family. And I'm part of the family, aren't I? I found a good use for it instead of letting it just collect dust. I raised my voice. That wasn't my money, Juliana. It was our parents'. You stole from our parents. Stole? That's so dramatic, Marina. You're exaggerating so much. We're a family. We share everything, she said, shrugging. Besides, you should be happy that I found a good use for that money instead of leaving it just lying there. At that moment, the front door opened. My parents had come home earlier than expected. What's going on here? Asked my father, his voice calm but with an alert tone. He clearly sensed the tension in the air. Dad, Mom, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but Juliana took the money from my room. The money you asked me to keep. And she spent it all, I said, my voice coming out louder than I intended. My mother's face went pale. Marina, that's not funny. Don't joke about something so serious. I'm not joking, Mom. Look at all the things she bought. And I heard her on the phone sending $10,000 to someone, a man named Derek. My mother looked at Juliana, waiting for an explanation. Juliana, in turn, also went pale but tried to maintain composure. Where did you get all this money? Asked my father slowly, his tone beginning to change. Dad, began Juliana, but my father raised his hand to silence her. I looked my father in the eyes. She took it from my room. That envelope you asked me to keep last night. My father turned to Juliana. Is it true? Juliana swallowed hard. She seemed to be having difficulty speaking. I thought it was Marina's money. I thought it was her savings. No, Juliana, said my father, his voice growing stronger. That was the money your mother and I got by selling everything we had at the property. The property my grandmother left us. We sold the boat I built with my father. We sold old furniture that belonged to your grandparents. We sold tools I've been collecting for years. Everything to get $15,000 to pay for your tuition next semester. My mother continued, her voice trembling. It took 2 months of weekends working to do all of that, Juliana. 2 months. We sold memories to pay for your education. Juliana grew increasingly pale as she listened. You sold the property? But I didn't know. Of course you didn't know, said my father, his voice now calm but terrible. We don't have the time or energy to tell you everything. We were too busy trying to save your future. Juliana began to cry. I didn't know it was so important. Marina, I'm sorry. I thought it was your money that you had saved from your work and that I could just borrow it. You borrowed it? I shouted. Juliana, you never even intended to return it. You were spending it like it was yours. And $10,000? You sent $10,000 to a guy you shouldn't even be talking to without our parents knowing. My father approached Juliana's shopping bags and began taking out the items. How much did you spend on each of these things? Juliana, now completely panicked, began to confess. The leather jacket was $1,800. The shoes were $95 each pair. I have 3 pairs. The dress was $350. The phone was $1,200. And the $10,000 went to Derek because he had gambling debts and people were threatening to hurt him. How much more? Asked my mother. I took my friends to that fancy restaurant downtown. We spent about $1,500 in one night. The rest went on small things here and there, confessed Juliana, through tears. My father sat down heavily on the sofa. So basically, you took the money we saved over months that came from sacrifice and hard work and just spent it on frivolous things and on a man who isn't worth it? Juliana couldn't even respond. My mother stood up and walked to her room without saying anything. When she returned, her eyes were red from crying. Juliana, said my mother, her voice trembling with anger and disappointment, you've crossed all the boundaries we set for you. That night, dinner was extremely uncomfortable. Juliana came to the table with red and swollen eyes, but didn't say a word. She just played with her food while the 3 of us ate in tense silence. Finally, my father put his fork on his plate and looked directly at Juliana. Your mother and I have made a decision. You won't return the money you stole because you simply don't have it anymore. But you will face the consequences of your theft. Juliana looked at him with hope in her eyes, but my father wasn't finished. Starting next semester, you will take a gap year from college, continued my father. You will look for a job and you will pay for your own tuition with your salary when you return to your studies. We won't give you a single cent for your education or anything else. But Dad, protested Juliana, I can't make enough money. College is very expensive. You know that. You should have thought about that before spending $15,000 that weren't yours, replied my father firmly. What followed was a very difficult period for the whole family. Juliana spent weeks trying to negotiate, cry, and beg, but my parents refused to back down. They had made a decision and were determined to make it stick. One night, about 2 weeks after all that chaos, I heard a soft knock on my bedroom door. It was almost midnight. I opened the door and found Juliana with red eyes from crying, looking desperate. Marina, can I come in? She asked in a whisper, looking nervously toward our parents' room. I let her in and quietly closed the door. What do you want, Juliana? I need to ask you something, she said, sitting on the foot of my bed. Could you lend me the $15,000? I promise I'll pay you back as soon as I graduate and get a real job. Please, Marina. You know how important college is to me. I looked at her in complete disbelief. Are you serious? After everything you did today, after stealing from our parents and destroying all their plans, you want me to just lend you money? Money you won't pay back. Marina, please, begged Juliana, tears streaming down her face. We're sisters. Family helps family, right? No, Juliana. Absolutely not, I replied, my voice firm. You made your choice today. You stole from our parents, you sent money to a guy who clearly is using you, and you spent like a queen. Now you have to face the consequences. Juliana stayed there for a moment longer, perhaps hoping I would change my mind, but when she saw that I wouldn't give in, she got up and left my room without saying anything else. I heard her bedroom door slam hard a few seconds later. That night, lying in bed, I began to think about all the other times Juliana had done similar things. When we were kids, she would always take my toys without asking permission. In high school, she would borrow my clothes without warning and sometimes return them torn or simply not return them at all. Once, she had stolen money from my piggy bank when I was saving for something special. And every time I complained to my parents, they said the same thing. She's your younger sister, Marina. She doesn't mean to hurt you. You need to learn to share. That made me wonder if our parents would be so angry if Juliana had stolen my savings instead of theirs, or if they would still be making excuses for her. The next morning, at breakfast, Juliana tried a different approach. She came downstairs looking remorseful and spoke in a low, apologetic voice. "I'm sorry for what I did yesterday. I know it was wrong. And I promise I'll never do something like this again." My father didn't even look up from his coffee. "Apologies don't change our decision, Juliana. You won't receive a single cent from us for school or anything else." "But I can't make enough money to pay for everything myself," protested Juliana, her voice beginning to sound desperate again. "That's something you should have considered before spending our money," replied my father coldly. That conversation ended there. Later that day, Juliana made a big show of packing her bags. She dragged things around noisily, making sure everyone could hear her going up the stairs with heavy feet. Then she dragged everything to the front door, leaving shopping bags and luggage strategically positioned where everyone could see. "Fine," she announced dramatically. "If you don't want me here, I'll go to a place where people actually care about me." And with that, she left, slamming the door behind her. We didn't hear from her the rest of the day. My parents were tense and silent all night. My mother tried to watch television, but clearly wasn't paying attention. My father just stood looking out the window. The next afternoon, the phone rang. It was my grandmother, and she sounded upset. "Marina, what happened there?" she asked, and I could hear concern in her voice. "Juliana called me crying saying you kicked her out of the house and don't want to let her finish college. She said you were responsible for everything." I called my father to pick up the phone. He explained the entire situation to my grandmother in detail. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "My God," my grandmother finally said. "I had no idea. Juliana made it seem like you were being unfair to her. She asked if I could lend her money to pay for college." "What did you say?" asked my father. "I said I would think about it, but after hearing this whole story, I definitely won't give her a cent. Actually, I'm going to check my house right now to make sure she didn't take anything when she visited us last month," replied my grandmother angrily. In the days that followed, the phone didn't stop ringing. My Aunt Sarah called asking why Juliana was asking for money. My Uncle Mike called because Juliana had shown up at his house with a story about needing help with college expenses. My cousin Jennifer called because Juliana had asked her to co-sign a student loan. Every time, my parents had to explain the true story. And every time, the relatives were shocked and refused to help Juliana. A week later, Juliana came back home alone. She looked defeated and exhausted. Her eyes were red from crying, and she moved like someone who had aged 10 years in just 1 week. "I went to everyone," she confessed, collapsing into a chair in the living room. "All the aunts, cousins, college friends, even some of Derek's friends. No one helped me. No one even wanted to hear my story." "Are you surprised?" asked my mother. I thought someone would have compassion," murmured Juliana, huddled in the chair. "Look," said my father, his voice a bit less severe now, "you're going to do what we talked about. You're going to take a gap year and you're going to work. But ask us again, can I at least stay here so I don't have to pay rent too? If I have to pay an apartment on top of everything else, I'll never be able to save enough to go back to college." My parents looked at each other, that kind of silent communication that long-married couples develop. Finally, my father took a deep breath. "You can stay," he said, "but you will follow our rules strictly. And don't ask us for money again. Not a single cent. Is that clear?" "It's clear," answered Juliana in a whisper. In the days that followed, Juliana began looking for a job. She went back to the university and informed them that she was leaving the program. It was difficult to watch my sister go through this, but at the same time, I knew it was necessary. She needed to learn a lesson that our parents had never been able to teach her properly. 2 weeks later, Juliana got a job as a waitress at a family restaurant not far from our house. It was a simple job, serving tables, cleaning, helping in the kitchen. The salary was minimum wage, but there were tips. In those first days, I could see how difficult it was for her. She came home with swollen feet, hands red from washing dishes, and a fatigue that seemed to penetrate her very being. But there was something different about her too, a determination I had never seen before. My father opened a special savings account for Juliana at the bank. Every week, when she received her salary, she handed it to our parents and they deposited everything into that account. She was only allowed to keep her tips for daily expenses. And the tips were meager, maybe $40 or $50 a week, when it was a good week. One day, about a month after Juliana started working, I was home visiting my parents. Juliana was leaving work and arrived through the front door in a uniform stained with food. Her hair was tied in a messy ponytail, her face was without makeup, and she looked completely exhausted. That evening, at dinner, my mother mentioned that Juliana had a particularly rude customer that day. He had complained about practically everything and had left a terrible tip despite Juliana working hard to make him satisfied. "Some customers are like that," said my father, trying to comfort her. "You can't let that affect you. You're doing a good job." Juliana just nodded, too tired to respond. We continued eating in relative silence. But there was something different in the family dynamic now. There was an absence of tension, but also a lack of joy. It was like the whole family was in a period of transition, learning how to live together after everything that had happened. One night, my father called me into the kitchen while Juliana was taking a shower. "Marina, I wanted to talk to you about something," he said, putting his hand on my shoulder. "What, Dad?" I asked. "I think I was too hard on Juliana," he confessed. "But I also think it was necessary. Do you believe she's really learning the lesson?" I looked my father in the eyes. "Honestly? Yes. She's different now. She's not that girl who thought the world owed her everything. She's really working hard." My father nodded slowly. "Your mother and I made a mistake raising Juliana. We spoiled her too much, never let her face consequences. Every time you complained that she was taking your things without asking, we told you to share. We taught Juliana that she could take whatever she wanted." "You're recognizing the mistake now," I said. "That's what matters." "I hope you're right," replied my father. "And Marina? I'm sorry for not being firmer with her from the beginning." Several months passed. Juliana's life had completely changed. She woke up early every day to go to work. She came home tired at night, ate quickly, and often fell asleep soon after. She had lost that artificial shine she had before, that constant need to have new and expensive things. Now she wore simple, old clothes. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She no longer had that $1,000 phone. She had sold it to a cell phone dealer and bought a much simpler phone, the kind people used 10 years ago. One night, when I visited my parents for dinner, Juliana was in the kitchen helping my mother prepare the meal. She looked different, not just because of the simple clothes or the lack of makeup, but there was something that had changed in her eyes. She seemed like someone who had finally understood that actions have consequences. "How's work going?" I asked her while she was cutting vegetables. "It's difficult," admitted Juliana, her voice low. "My feet hurt all the time, and some customers are very rude. But I'm learning a lot. And you know what, Marina? Now when I see something that costs $100, I think about how that's 2 full days of work for me." I agreed with her. "That's a good way to think about it. I keep thinking about those $15,000, continued Juliana, her voice trembling a little. "And how many hours Mom and Dad worked to get that money. I just threw it all away like it meant nothing. Like that money didn't represent months and months of their sacrifice." My mother, who was listening from the other end of the kitchen, came over to hug Juliana. And for the first time in a long time, Juliana didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," said Juliana, crying on my mother's shoulder. "I'm sorry for everything. It wasn't mine to take. I stole from you and I can't even apologize for it." My mother simply hugged her harder. "You're learning now. That's what matters." When I got home that night, I began to reflect on everything that had happened. About how that theft, that family crisis, had forced all of us to face difficult truths about ourselves. 3 months had passed since Juliana started working. During that time, our family dynamic had changed in ways I never would have imagined. My parents continued depositing every cent Juliana earned into that special account. She had access only to her tips, which were often tiny. One night, while I was visiting my parents, my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen while Juliana was in the bathroom. "Marina, we would like to talk to you about something important," she said, lowering her voice. "What?" I asked, worried. "We're considering letting Juliana go back to college next year," said my mother. "But we want to do it in a way that keeps her responsible." My father appeared in the kitchen doorway. "We've decided to let Juliana access that savings account on her 21st birthday in December. At that point, she can choose. She can use the money to go back to college, or she can do something else with it." "What would that something else be?" I asked. "Well," said my father, hesitating a bit, "she could give the money to Derek." My heart raced. "Dad, you're not serious. You're really leaving that as an option?" "Yes," replied my father. "But if she chooses Derek over college, she will have to move out of this house permanently. We can't support someone who chooses a man who steals from her and uses her over her own future." My mother added, "We know Derek is still asking her for money. He calls constantly, always with a new excuse, always with more gambling debts." "How do you know that?" I asked. "Juliana told us," replied my father. "She's being honest with us now. Derek wants her to ask us for more money, but she refused. She told him she had lost access to the money and couldn't help anymore. I took that information home with me. I thought about how Juliana had changed. Months ago, she would have done anything to get more money for Derek. But now she was refusing his requests. A week later, I received a call from my mother. "Marina, you need to know what happened with Juliana and Derek," she said. "What?" I asked, worried. "He broke up with her," replied my mother. "He called last night completely furious because Juliana refused to ask for more money. He started being very cruel to her, saying she was selfish and that if she really loved him, she would find a way to help him. When Juliana explained again that she didn't have access to the money, he just hung up and hasn't responded to her calls." "How is she?" I asked. "Surprisingly well," replied my mother. "I think a part of her always knew that Derek wasn't good for her. He only cared when she had money to give." The months continued to pass. Juliana kept her job at the restaurant. She had become one of the best waitresses there, always with a smile on her lips despite the tiredness. Her coworkers liked her, and some of the regular customers started asking to sit at her table specifically. In July, my parents invited Juliana and me to spend a week at that property near the river, the property they had rebuilt. It was the first time all of us had gone back there since everything had been sold. The place was unrecognizable. My parents had spent the whole summer cleaning, painting, and making repairs. There were new furniture they bought to replace the old. The walls were fresh and bright, and the place exuded a sense of peace I had never felt there before. On the third night of our vacation, Juliana and I were sitting on the porch, watching the river as the sun set. It was all so calm and serene. "You know," Juliana said suddenly, "I never really understood money very well before. But now I understand how difficult it is to earn even $50. When I see something that costs $100, I think about how many days of work that is for me." "That's an important perspective," I replied. "I keep thinking about those $15,000, continued Juliana, her voice trembling a little. "About how many hours Mom and Dad worked to get that money. How many memories they gave up. And I just gave it all away like it meant nothing." "You can't go back in time," I said gently. "But you can make sure you never do something like that again." "I know," replied Juliana firmly. "I swear I won't. Never again." I watched my sister in that sunset, and I noticed that she had really changed. It wasn't just because of the simple clothes or the lack of makeup. There was a deeper transformation. She seemed like someone who had finally learned a lesson she should have learned a long time ago. "Juliana," I said, "I'm proud of you. Of the hard work you've done. Of how you've changed." She turned to look at me, and her eyes filled with tears. "Thank you, Marina. That means a lot to me, especially coming from you." We sat in silence, watching the river flow, each with our own thoughts. When we returned home after that vacation, the dynamic had changed even more. Juliana continued working, but now there was a sense of purpose in everything she did. She saved every penny possible. She had even started attending some online classes on her own to stay academically engaged while working. In October, something important happened. My mother called me to tell me that Juliana had received a promotion at the restaurant. She was now responsible for training new employees and earned a slightly better salary, plus tips. "She's very happy," said my mother. "And she's saving even more now. She's determined to have enough to go back to college in January." When I talked to Juliana about the promotion, she was genuinely excited, but in a different way than she would have been before all that situation. Before, she would have wanted to spend the money on frivolous things. Now, all she wanted was to invest in her future. "You know what's interesting?" Juliana told me one day. "Some of the new employees, they complain about how difficult it is to work here. And I just thought, if you find this difficult, wait until you have to support yourself completely." That's what taught me the importance of work. Not just theoretically, but in practice. In November, an unexpected thing happened. Juliana approached me while I was home visiting my parents. "Marina, do you have a minute?" she asked. "Of course," I replied. "What do you want?" "I wanted to apologize properly," said Juliana. "Not just to Mom and Dad, but to you too. You were the person who was right from the beginning. You always knew that what you were doing was wrong, and you still did it. And afterward you were so harshly criticized for it." "Juliana," I began to say. "No, let me finish," she continued. "I stole from you too, didn't I? I invaded your room. I took something that wasn't mine, and then I had the audacity to get angry when you called me a thief. I'm sorry. You didn't deserve to be treated that way." That was an important moment for me too. I realized that during all that time, I had focused on the anger I felt, but I hadn't really processed the fact that I had also been violated personally. That money was in my room. Juliana had come into my personal space and stolen something important. "Thank you for apologizing," I said. "And sorry for being so hard on you afterward. I should have tried to be more understanding." "No, you were right to be hard on me," replied Juliana. "I needed it. Without that harshness, without those consequences, I would still be that spoiled girl I was before." As December approached, the date of Juliana's birthday drew closer. I knew my parents were anxious about how she would react when she had to make that crucial choice. A week before her birthday, my mother told me something that left her very worried. "Derek called again," she said. "He asked if Juliana would talk to him again. Apparently, he heard that she's about to receive a significant amount of money." My blood boiled at hearing this. Derek was exactly the kind of man who shouldn't be near my sister. And here he was, trying to win her back now that she had money again. "What did she say?" I asked. "She refused," replied my mother. "She said she had no interest in talking to him and asked him not to call again. She's very determined, Marina. I think she's really learned her lesson this time." On Juliana's birthday, my parents organized a small family dinner. It wasn't a big celebration like it would have been before, but there was a sense of significance in the air. My father had reserved a table at a modest Italian restaurant, nothing very expensive, but cozy and pleasant. Juliana was wearing a simple dress she had bought with her tips, nothing designer, nothing extravagant. Her hair was loose, falling naturally over her shoulders. She looked young, but also mature in a way I had never seen before. During dinner, my father finally brought up the topic we were all waiting for. "Juliana, you are now 21 years old," said my father, putting his fork on his plate. "And that means the savings account we opened for you is now under your control." Juliana swallowed hard. She knew this was coming, but even so, she seemed nervous. "We deposited every cent you earned during these last months in that account," continued my father. "Adding up the tips you kept and the money you saved in other ways, you now have approximately $18,000. Juliana's eyes widened. "18,000? But I thought it was less." "You worked hard," said my mother with a smile. "And you were very careful with your expenses. You deserved every cent. What you need to know," said my father, his voice growing more serious, "is that you now have two options. You can use this money to return to college next semester. We will help you with the rest of the tuition, and you can concentrate on your studies while working a part-time job if necessary." Juliana nodded, paying attention to every word. "Or," continued my father, hesitating, "you can do something else with this money. But if you choose something that isn't education, you will have to move out of this house. We won't continue to support you if you make a choice that puts you at risk again." Silence fell over the table. I knew exactly what my father was referring to, Derek and his gambling debts. "I understand," said Juliana slowly. "And I already know what my choice is." "What is it?" asked my mother, holding her breath. "I want to go back to college," said Juliana, her voice firm and determined. "I won't waste this money like I wasted the last one. I've already wasted so much time, and I want to have a better future. I want to graduate and get a good job. I want to be able to offer something to my family instead of just taking from them." My father and mother exchanged a look, and both began to cry. They were tears of relief, of hope, of seeing their daughter finally understand what really mattered. "I'm very proud of you," said my father, his voice trembling. After that dinner, things began to change again. But this time, in a positive and constructive way. Juliana began making plans to return to university next semester. She would continue working at the restaurant, but on a reduced schedule that would allow her to also attend classes. My parents helped with the remaining tuition, just as they had offered. But now there was a fundamental difference. Juliana was working hard and contributing significantly to her own education. She wasn't just someone receiving favors. She was someone fighting for her own future. In those final months of the year, as Juliana prepared to return to college, I realized how that entire situation had impacted not just her, but my whole family. My mother had finally confronted the fact that she had raised Juliana too permissively, always protecting her from the consequences of her actions. My father had learned that sometimes true love means being tough, means saying no, means letting people face the natural consequences of their choices. And I had learned that justice isn't always linear. That sometimes the person who does wrong is the same person who most needs help to redeem themselves. That anger and resentment, though justified, are feelings that don't need to last forever. One night in December, I was in the kitchen with Juliana while she helped my mother make dinner. "Marina, can I tell you something?" asked Juliana while she was cutting vegetables. "Of course," I replied. "A few days ago, Derek found me outside the restaurant," she said. "He wanted to talk to me." He said he heard that I had received an inheritance from an uncle or something, and that I could help him with his debts now. My heart raced. What did you say? I just looked at him and asked how he knew about the money, considering I never mentioned anything to him, replied Juliana. He started making excuses, saying a friend of mine had mentioned it. But the truth is, he never really cared about me. He always saw me as a walking bank. And what did you do? I asked. I simply walked away, said Juliana. I didn't yell, I wasn't cruel. I just didn't want anything to do with him anymore. And you know what's interesting? When he saw that I wouldn't give him money, he didn't even try to reach out to me afterward. He just gave up. I made a mental note that Juliana had truly grown. She was no longer seeking validation from a man who didn't deserve her. She was focused on herself and her future. As the year drew to a close, I also began making some changes in my own life. My parents had offered me an invitation to move out and find my own place. They said I had stayed there too long, that it was time for me to start my own adult life completely. So, in January of the new year, I signed a lease for a small but nice apartment, about 20 minutes away from my parents' house. It was an important step for me, too. I was leaving the security of home and facing the world on my own. The weekend I moved, my father showed up with some of his friends to help load the boxes. My mother brought recipes and shared with me how to prepare some of her favorite dishes. Even Juliana showed up with some things she thought I might need. I had a wall mirror I wasn't using, said Juliana, handing me the mirror. You can have it if you want. That simple gesture meant more to me than she probably knew. It wasn't just a mirror. It was Juliana offering something to me selflessly, without expecting anything in return. It was a sign of how much she had truly changed. Several months later, I visited my parents and had an important conversation with my mother. You know, she said while we drank tea in the kitchen, I feel like we learned more as a family in these last months than in previous years. How so? I asked. Well, replied my mother, we faced some very difficult truths about how we were raising Juliana, about how you felt marginalized, about how we weren't being as firm as we should have been. All of that was necessary. Sometimes families need to go through something difficult to really grow together. Do you think Juliana learned the lesson permanently? I asked. Honestly? I think so, replied my mother. But I also think that if we had taught her this more clearly from the beginning, it wouldn't have needed to reach this point. That's our regret, that it took such a big crisis for all of us to wake up. As the months continued to pass, Juliana really dedicated herself to her studies. She worked in the afternoons and evenings, and during the day she was at college, attending classes, going to the library to study, forming study groups with her classmates. When I saw my sister now, I saw a determined young woman, someone who had learned the real value of money, of hard work, and of the consequences of her actions. She was still young, still had much to learn, but there was a fundamental change in how she saw the world. One Sunday, I was visiting my parents when my mother brought up a subject she had been avoiding. Marina, we would like to talk to you about something, said my mother, looking at my father. What? I asked, with some apprehension. About that theft, about the whole episode with Juliana, said my father. We would like you to know that we now see how you were treated unfairly by us over all these years. How so? I asked, even though I already had some idea of what he was going to say. When Juliana took your things, we told you to share, replied my mother. When she stole money from your piggy bank, we excused her by saying she was a child. We put the responsibility on you to be the older sister, to be more understanding, to be more mature. And that wasn't fair. Tears began to roll down my face. I didn't realize how much I had needed to hear this. We let you carry a weight that wasn't yours to carry, continued my father. And we want you to know that we see this now, and that we are very sorry. Thank you, I whispered, because I really couldn't speak anymore. That conversation healed me in a way I didn't expect. My anger, which had been so intense for months, finally began to dissipate. My parents had acknowledged their mistake. They were making real changes. And Juliana was really changing. When I got home that night, to my new apartment that I was still learning to call home, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. A year had passed since that day when Juliana made her choice at the Italian restaurant. A whole year of transformation, of growth, of learning. And now came the time to truly close this chapter of our lives. Juliana had graduated in her first year back at college with excellent grades. She had not only recovered academically, but had also become a standout student, participating in special projects and gaining recognition from her professors. She still worked at the restaurant, but was now an assistant manager, supervising other employees and helping to train new waiters. My parents were incredibly proud, not just of her grades or professional success, but of the person she had become. The spoiled, self-centered, and irresponsible girl had transformed into a mature young woman, hardworking and with a sense of responsibility. I had grown too. My apartment was now truly mine, decorated with things I chose carefully, hard-earned through work. My career at the bank had advanced, and I had been promoted to department manager. Life was going well, but there was a loose thread that still bothered me, Derek. There had never been any real resolution with Derek. He had simply disappeared from Juliana's life when he realized he couldn't extract money from her anymore. But a few months earlier, Juliana told me something that changed everything. "Marina, I need to talk to you about something," said Juliana when we met for coffee one Saturday afternoon. "What?" I asked, watching her carefully. "Derek showed up again," she replied. "Or rather, he appeared near the restaurant where I work. He was with another girl, someone I know slightly, a former college acquaintance. She was wearing expensive jewelry, a gold watch, designer bags. And I realized he was doing exactly the same thing to her that he had done to me. My blood boiled. He's manipulating another girl?" "Yes," confirmed Juliana, with anger in her eyes. "And the worst part is that this girl is too young to understand what's happening. She seems to be from a wealthy family, and he's clearly just using her to have access to her family's money. Are you going to talk to her?" I asked. "I'm considering it," replied Juliana. "But I'm also furious at everything he did, not just to me, but apparently to other women too. He shouldn't just go around destroying girls' lives." That set something in motion within me. Derek had hurt my sister, had caused problems in my family, and apparently was doing it again to other girls. While Juliana had paid the consequences of her actions, Derek had simply moved on, looking for his next victim. I decided to investigate. Using my access at the bank and some contacts I had developed over the years, I began researching Derek. What I discovered was a disturbing pattern. Derek had a history of relationships with women from wealthy families. There were traces of money being transferred, of women who later sought psychological help after breaking up with him, of growing debts that apparently were never paid. He had accounts at several different banks, all with negative balances. He had collection orders from loan sharks, and there were rumors that he was involved with dangerous people who lent money. One night, I was talking to a friend of mine who worked in the legal department of a large company. I casually mentioned that I knew someone who seemed to be involved in romantic fraud. "Marina, what you're describing is a crime," she said. "If you have evidence, you should report it." That planted a seed in my mind. Perhaps there was a legal way to deal with this, a way that wouldn't put me at risk, and that could really make a difference. I talked with Juliana and my parents about what I had discovered. My father, who was generally averse to confrontation, surprised everyone. "He hurt my daughter," said my father, his voice cold and determined. "If there's a legal way to hold him accountable, we're going to do it. He can't just destroy girls' lives and get away with it." We decided to hire a private investigator, an experienced man named Robert Chen, who had decades of experience in fraud and tracking criminal schemes. Robert spent 3 weeks investigating Derek. What he discovered was even worse than I had imagined. Derek had 7 different women he was contacting simultaneously, all believing they were his exclusive girlfriends. He had stolen approximately $120,000 from various women over the past 5 years. There were records of loans that were never repaid, of money transferred to third-party accounts that were apparently controlled by loan sharks, of purchases made with his victims' credit cards. There was also evidence that Derek was involved with dangerous people. There were text conversations in which he discussed gambling debts with someone who was clearly threatening him. With this information in hand, we first went to the police. A detective named Morrison heard our complete story. "This is a classic case of romantic fraud," said Detective Morrison, taking notes. "The victims need to be willing to testify. Can you convince the other women to cooperate?" Robert began the process of contacting Derek's other victims. Most were reluctant at first, embarrassed or humiliated at having been deceived. But as they learned that there were other victims, that they weren't alone, their attitudes began to change. A woman named Sophie was the first to agree to cooperate fully. She was a few years older than Juliana, a successful professional who had been manipulated into handing over $30,000 for Derek's gambling debts. "I want him to answer for this," said Sophie during a meeting with Detective Morrison. "I want all the other women to know that it's not our fault. He's a sophisticated criminal who knows exactly how to exploit women's insecurities and emotions to get what he wants." Another victim, Catherine, shared an even more disturbing story. Derek had convinced her to take out a loan in her name, a debt she was now struggling to pay. "He disappeared," said Catherine with anger and pain in her voice. "He just disappeared once the loan money arrived. And now I'm responsible for a $40,000 debt that I didn't voluntarily take out." As the case developed, it became clear that Derek had committed not just romantic fraud, but also identity fraud, credit fraud, and theft. Detective Morrison was working with white-collar crime units to build a solid case. 3 months later, Derek was arrested. When Juliana told me that he had finally been arrested, something inside her finally seemed to loosen. She had been carrying the burden of guilt and shame for so long, even though she rationally knew it wasn't just her fault, that Derek had manipulated her emotions. "You know," said Juliana during a family dinner when everyone gathered to celebrate, "I spent so much time thinking that I was guilty, that I was stupid for believing him, that I deserved to be deceived because I was spoiled and irresponsible." "But you didn't deserve to be deceived," said my mother firmly. "He's a criminal, Juliana. What he did is not your fault. Yes, you stole the money from our parents, and you paid the consequences. But Derek is responsible for his own criminal actions." "I think I can finally let this go," said Juliana, and for the first time in a long time, I saw genuine peace on her face. Derek's trial took 6 months to unfold. The victims testified one by one, sharing their stories of manipulation, deception, and theft. Juliana was one of the witnesses. She spoke about how Derek had convinced her to steal money from her parents, about how he kept asking for more and more, about how she finally realized he didn't really love her. "He used me," said Juliana in the courtroom, her voice clear and firm. "He knew I was vulnerable, that I was a young person who had made a serious mistake, and he exploited that. He said he loved me, but he only wanted my money." Derek was convicted to 5 years in prison for fraud, theft, identity fraud, and emotional manipulation for financial gain. Additionally, he was ordered to compensate his victims for the money he had stolen. It wouldn't be complete restitution. Most victims would never recover everything, but it was something. It was justice, at least in the legal form. When Juliana left the courtroom on the last day of the trial, she ran to my parents and me and hugged us tightly. "Finally," she whispered. "Finally I can move forward." But to my surprise, it wasn't just Derek who would face consequences. It turned out he had been working with a criminal loan agent named Vincent Russo, who provided money to people with gambling problems and then forced them to pay exorbitant interest rates. Detective Morrison explained during a meeting that Vincent had been offering money to Derek so he could keep his gambling addiction fed, and Derek in return provided names and contacts of wealthy women he could manipulate. "This is a much larger scheme," said Detective Morrison. "Derek isn't the only criminal here. He's a cog in a much bigger machine." This led to a broader investigation. Federal agents were involved. More victims were found, not just women who had been deceived by Derek, but also men who had borrowed money from Vincent and were now being pursued for impossible-to-pay debts. The case expanded to include organized crime, extortion fraud, and organized crime. It took 2 more years, but eventually Vincent Russo and several of his associates were also arrested and convicted. During all those 2 years, Juliana continued with her life. She graduated from college with honors. She got a job at a well-reputed management company, starting as an assistant but quickly being promoted for her hard work and dedication. I had also continued to evolve in my career. I had received offers from other banks, but I decided to stay where I was, with people I knew and trusted. My parents finally allowed themselves to relax a bit. The property near the river, which had been the center of all that drama, became a place of peace and restoration. They spent many weekends there, enjoying the work they had done to rebuild it. 2 years after the final trial, on a quiet Sunday, my whole family gathered at that property for a special celebration. It was the 2-year anniversary of Juliana returning to college. "I wanted to do this here," said Juliana, looking around at all of us, "because this place represents everything we went through, everything we learned." She then revealed that she had written a book. It wasn't a self-help book or a sensationalized drama, but an honest narrative about her experiences. About the theft, about the consequences, about learning responsibility through pain, about being manipulated by someone she thought loved her, and finally about finding her own way again. "I was thinking," said Juliana, "about all the girls who are being manipulated like I was. All the women who are being deceived, who are feeling guilty, who are thinking they're the only ones. I wanted to share my story so they would know they're not alone, that there is hope after darkness." My father had tears in his eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Juliana. Not just for the book, but for everything you've become." "We are too," added my mother, taking Juliana's hand. But what happened next was truly unexpected. Juliana's book became a bestseller. Not in a dramatic overnight way, but gradually, through word of mouth and recommendations. Women who had been victims of romantic fraud began to contact her. Journalists wanted to interview her. She was invited to speak at universities about abusive relationships and emotional manipulation. But more importantly, Juliana began to receive messages from girls who had read her book and realized they were in manipulative relationships. Some of them managed to get out. Some managed to seek help. One girl even managed to stop a boyfriend before being completely financially ruined. "Marina," said Juliana one night when we met for wine at my apartment, "the book has already sold over 100,000 copies. The royalties. They're incredible. But more than that, I'm helping people. That's all that matters to me now. Do you know how all this started, don't you?" I asked her. "What?" replied Juliana. "With that theft," I said. "With you stealing $15,000 from our parents. If that hadn't happened, you would never have learned the lesson. You would never have grown. You would never have written this book. And you would never have helped all these people." Juliana was silent for a long moment. "You know, I've thought a lot about that. And while I wouldn't recommend anyone go through what I went through, I also recognize that it was necessary. There are no shortcuts to real growth. It has to come through pain and genuine repentance." 3 years after Derek's trial, I received a special invitation. Juliana had been invited to be a keynote speaker at a conference on romantic fraud and financial crime. She asked if I would like to come. Watching my sister on the stage of that conference was a moment of pure catharsis for me. That girl who had been so self-centered, so irresponsible, so unable to see beyond her own desires, was now helping hundreds of people understand their own patterns of harmful relationships. She spoke with wisdom that came only from lived experience. She didn't judge the women in the audience. Instead, she offered understanding and hope. She told them it was possible to recover, that it was possible to learn, that it was possible to become a better person. When she came down from the stage, a whole crowd of women surrounded her. Many crying, many thanking her, many sharing their own stories. That night, when we returned to the hotel where we were staying, I had a conversation with Juliana that would again change how I understood this entire journey. "You know," she said, sitting on the bed in the hotel room, "I spent years hating myself. Hating the theft I committed, hating the fact that I was deceived by Derek, hating the person I was before all of this. But now I understand that that girl, despite all her flaws, had to exist for me to become who I am now." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Well," replied Juliana, "if I had never stolen that money, if I had never felt the weight of real consequences, I would still be that spoiled and irresponsible girl. If I had never been manipulated by Derek, I would never have truly understood how dangerous emotional manipulation can be. All those terrible events were necessary to shape who I am now." "But you didn't deserve to suffer," I said, wanting to validate her suffering as well. "No, I didn't deserve to," agreed Juliana. "But it happened. And instead of letting it destroy me, I chose to learn from it. And now I'm using that experience to help other people not fall into the same traps I fell into." In the months that followed, something unexpected but truly rewarding began to happen. Derek's victims began to connect with each other through a support group that Juliana had helped organize. They began to share stories, process trauma collectively, and support each other mutually. Sophie, who had been one of the first victims to cooperate with police, ended up becoming a good friend of Juliana's. They began to collaborate on workshops and seminars about recognizing signs of emotional abuse and manipulation. "You know," said Sophie during a lunch with Juliana and me, "when Derek deceived me, I thought he had destroyed my life. I lost $30,000, I lost my sense of trust, I lost my sense of security. But meeting Juliana and the other women, hearing their stories, realizing it wasn't just me, that changed everything for me. What began as a family tragedy, a theft, an abusive relationship, a financial crisis, had evolved into something that was really making a difference in the world. Not just for Juliana and her family, but for hundreds of women who had been victims of romantic fraud. My parents, seeing how everything unfolded, began to talk about how the experience of almost losing Juliana, of seeing their daughter struggle with the consequences of her actions, had really changed them as people. "We were too permissive," said my mother at a family lunch. "We let Juliana do things we would never have allowed Marina to do. And while all this drama was terrible to go through, I think it taught us something important about parenting." "What?" I asked. "That love doesn't just mean giving your child everything he wants," replied my father. "Sometimes love means saying no. It means letting them face the consequences of their actions. It means being firm even when it's difficult." 5 years after the beginning of that whole story, my family was completely different from how it was before. Not just because Juliana had grown and learned, but because we all had learned. I had learned that justice, although it can be painful, is important. That sometimes you need to take action to protect other people from a predator. That anger is valid, but it doesn't need to be your final destination. Juliana had learned that actions have consequences, but that consequences don't need to be your end. That it's possible to recover from serious mistakes. That it's possible to become a better person through suffering and repentance. My parents had learned that parenting requires firmness along with love. That sometimes the most difficult things you do for your child are the most important things. At that property near the river where everything had begun, where my parents had worked on weekends selling their memories to get the money that was stolen, there was now peace and a real sense of restoration. One summer afternoon, we were all sitting on the porch watching the river flow. Me, Juliana, my parents, and even Sophie, who had become part of our extended family. "You know," said Juliana, breaking the peaceful silence, "if someone had told me 5 years ago that all this was going to happen, that I would steal $15,000 from you, that I would be manipulated by a criminal, that my theft would lead to the capture of an organized crime network, that I would write a book that would help hundreds of women, I would have thought they were crazy." "Life is strange like that," replied my father, taking my mother's hand. "Sometimes the darkest moments lead to the greatest growth. And sometimes," I added, "what you think will be the end of a story is just the beginning of a completely different one." As the sun set over that river, casting a golden glow over everything, I felt a sense of closure. It wasn't a perfect ending. No one had truly won in this situation. Derek was in prison, but that wouldn't return the lost money. Juliana had learned an expensive lesson, but the price she paid was extremely high. My parents still carried the sadness of having made mistakes in their parenting. But there was something more important than any perfect ending. There was redemption. There was growth. There was love that had been tested and strengthened instead of being broken. And there was the certainty that, in a peculiar and unexpected way, all that pain had resulted in something good. Lives had been saved. Relationships had been repaired. A girl who had started out as irresponsible and self-centered had become a woman who dedicated her life to helping other women not fall into the same traps she had fallen into. Perhaps, I thought, this is what redemption really means. It's not about eliminating the mistakes of the past. It's about learning from them, growing through them, and then using that wisdom to make a genuine difference in the world. And as I watched my sister laughing with Sophie, as I watched my parents squeeze each other, as I felt the peace that came from finally letting go of the anger I had carried for so long, I realized that the story hadn't ended in defeat. It had ended in hope.